Okay, Audrey, it looks like, yeah, you have the recording going right now. So
Yes, we
we are
should be good to
right.
go.
Thanks, Audrey. We are right at the top of the hour now. So Joe, if you want to go ahead and share your slides, we'll get your slides up.
All right, let me.
Welcome everybody to the Fire Lab seminar series. This is the second seminar in our fall lineup here. And today we have Joe O'Brien from the Southern Research Station. So while Joe's getting his slides loaded here, I'll just do a quick intro. So Joe is a research ecologist and the project leader at the Center for Forest Disturbance Science of the USDA Forest Service Southern Research Station. Since joining the Forest Service in 2002, Joe's research is centered on fire science, specifically the spatial interactions among wildland fuels, fire behavior, and fire effects. His graduate training and prior work experience have given him expertise in plant ecology and ecophysiology, conservation science, and forest management. He has global fire experience with active research on fire ecology in Latin America and the Caribbean. He's worked as an ecologist in the southeastern US and neotropics for 33 years. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from SUNY Geneseo and his master's and PhD in biological sciences from Florida International University. And with that, Joe, I am going to hand it over to you. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you. I hate to ask it, but is my screen being shared?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, good. All right. So thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you today. And what I'm going to focus on is a new initiative, kind of a grassroots initiative centered on building some prescribed fire science and applications that grew out of kind of an organic collaboration among some long-term colleagues, Kevin Hires, Scott Goodrick, Rod Lynn, Louise Loudermilk. The list goes on, but today I'm just going to show you what our motivation is, what our plan is, and give you an example of some of the work we're starting to do, and then also offer an invitation to come join the fun. So motivation for why we felt the time was right to kind of pursue this initiative. When I first was hired by the Forest Service back in 2002 in Georgia, I was living in Utah, and I just moved there. I'd been there about a year, and I was thoroughly enjoying the Western United States, all the recreational opportunities. And I got a phone call from Dale Wade, who was a fire scientist hired back in 1959 at the Southern Fire Lab. And he offered me a job in Georgia. And I came for the interview, and it turns out he had gotten his degree from University of Montana, Missoula. I said, "Why would you go from Missoula to Georgia?" And he said, "If you want to study fire, being in the South is a good place to be." And I was like, okay, we'll see. And it turns out he was right. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about why Dale was right, and sort of, I've come around on living in the South and studying fire, and I'm glad I made the decision to take the job. So if we think about fire, and a lot of this will be preaching to the choir, there's several realms of fire really in the United States and in the world. We could extend this globally too, but we have sort of three main types of fire. Some are driven by ignition motivation and sort of societal implications to their effects. And we have wildfires, large wildfires in the upper right hand panel here. And then you have agricultural burning, and then you have prescribed fire, the intentional ignition to manage forest resources mainly, and you could argue grasslands and wetlands as well. But you see that, if we map out MODIS fire detections, which are notoriously poor at detecting the kinds of fires that would be described as prescribed fire and cropland fire, we see that there's a hotspot in the southeastern United States. And when we look at more data on who's doing the burning and what kind of burning is happening, we see there's a tremendous amount of prescribed fire happening in the South, but mostly on private property or state land. The federal land holdings in the South represent only about 9% of the land base. So there's been this tremendous activity in using fire to manage landscapes. It's gone on for thousands of years, and different kinds of people have started and stopped using it, but there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to this kind of burning, both from the perspective of fire science and also just in I think in general as a topic to pursue, both in terms of why people are doing it, how they're doing it. And so this is part of the motivation that I'm going to talk about. And there was enough motivation that a group of us, we started thinking about all the complexities that go into how you use fire intentionally to manage a landscape, all the complexities in choosing the day and the techniques to ignite, and then the complexities of the fire itself with the really complicated fire line interactions that are all designed to have generally an ecological outcome. And even if you're talking about fuels management, it's still vegetation management. So we realized that there was kind of a knowledge gap, and the focus on suppression and wildfire had left an opportunity for a new sort of defined science realm. So we wrote this paper defining that research agenda, and a lot of the folks that participate in this are now also involved in this and the initiative that I'm going to describe today. So we felt like there is opportunity in defining prescribed fire science because of the way prescribed fires are conducted. You can collect a lot of information in advance of the fire. You can often have easy access to the fire for instrumentation. So pragmatically, there's a lot of reasons why it could be a useful discipline, but then also just the intent is so different that we felt it deserved special recognition. So part of these differences, I just mentioned, the objectives are different. The motives are generally ecological, vegetation management, either for fuels reduction or for habitat quality or endangered species management, any number of motivations, ecological motivations you can think of. And besides the opportunities, the techniques are just fundamentally different. Most prescribed fires, at least in the United States, are ignited under what would be marginal conditions for wildfires. So obviously you're trying to ignite fires that aren't going to escape and get out of control, but this has implications. So they're fires that are burning under marginal conditions. The real focus is on how you ignite the fire. You're taking a cold landscape and you're applying fire to it. And how you apply that fire has a real impact. And there's not a lot of really good understanding of the implications of some of these different patterns. The fire behavior and the fire effects are mostly driven by the interactions among these multiple ignition patterns. And then there's other motivations that come into play, like smoke management. The person who ignites the fire is responsible for the smoke they create. So there's got to be a lot of interest and focus on being able to predict where your smoke's going to go and hopefully mitigate its impacts. And the other thing is these are repetitive treatments in the Southeast. The productivity is so high that fires must be repeated in most ecosystems if you're going to achieve your target on the order of every 3 years. So it's not a one and done. It's just it's a process. And recognizing fire as a process, not an event, has been a real focus of some of my research. So let's take a look at a state in the southern region, Georgia. Georgia in fiscal year 20 burned about 1 million acres. The 5-year average is about 1.2 million acres. 2020, we had 5,000 acres of wildfire. So it's just a fundamentally different landscape. The majority of the acres burned are burned intentionally with management objectives in mind. However, Georgia's got about 25 million acres of forest. Apologize for the English system. I'm going to go back and forth a few times, but about the same amount of forest as Montana, roughly. About half of it is considered burnable, meaning it's not embedded in a city or it's not a plantation where they don't want to burn. And if we look at that long-term or that 5-year average, they're hitting about 20% if you consider the 3-year fire return interval sort of objective. So we're still missing around 75, 80% of the burnable acres in Georgia. In the South, where prescribed fire is relatively easy and socially acceptable, but we're still missing a big chunk of the forest. So there are problems that need to be solved. So what are the problems? So you can ask the people who do the burning, and there's the usual suspects: resources, don't have enough people or money, weather was crummy. Some people are afraid of being sued, but that's actually been pretty progressively taken care of in many ways. And I'm a Yankee, but I've heard that many times, the people from the North moving to the South who don't understand the Southern culture of fire. And that's partially true. But we can't really help with some of those, but we can certainly help with some of the techniques and prescription windows, designing scenarios, fine-tuning ecological objectives, better smoke management. A science focused on prescribed fire can help solve some of these problems. And certainly widening prescription windows and managing smoke more effectively will increase the amount of acres that we can burn. So we're in the 21st century. Complexity is increasing, and it's not just the cliche wildland user interface problems of complexity. We have ecological problems causing complexity as well, and they're not all related to increased flammability, but the entire east coast of the United States and many of the Okie systems are experiencing this phenomena that's been labeled mesification, where a shift in vegetation type and species composition is actually making it harder to burn, and undesirable forest conditions are resulting as such. And if you look at the suite of tools available to help prescribed fire managers make decisions, they're just not adequate. The focus on sort of rate of spread and tactical wildfire decision making has left a lot of space for tools that prescribed fire managers need. So we saw this sort of need and knowledge gap, and we also saw opportunity in pushing some basic science, and we decided to form the hub. So why now? We've been talking about how prescribed fire is this critical tool to help us solve wildfire problems everywhere. So in the South, we need it to maintain our ecosystems. It's also seen as a tool to reduce the risk of undesirable and catastrophic wildfires. But we've been talking about it for a long, long time. And we just decided that, let's see if we can actually start doing something about it. And we live in the land of prescribed fire, so it's our duty to see if we can take the knowledge and the science that can promote the increased application of prescribed fire. And let's gather all of our resources and see what we can do. So what I say, when we have the technology, we've been working for about 10 years on some modeling tools that are explicitly designed to help inform prescribed fire. The fruition of that has been the development of the Quickfire fire behavior model. And we also have other monitoring and inventory techniques that we've developed that we feel are ready to start implementing and fine tuning. That really dates me. That's Steve Austin, the $6 Million Man. The other thing is when Dale Wade hired me, he was part of the legacy of the Southern Fire Lab. And it was the first fire lab. And I'm speaking to the second fire lab. And it was closed down in 1997 for a variety of reasons, but the oral history that was given to me in my unit is the reincarnation of that lab personnel. The remaining scientists were moved to Athens to form the unit that I'm now project leader of. So there's a direct legacy of the original Southern Fire Lab in our current work unit. And one of the reasons they said they shut down the Southern Fire Lab is that prescribed fire was in the purview of the states and private citizens, and that the focus for federal wildfire research should be on fire research should be on wildfires. So that's just interesting that we've come full circle and talking about prescribed fires being a solution. The other thing is we've reincarnated the fire lab in a miniature way. We've built a small combustion facility, a medium-sized combustion facility, where we're able to do some sort of mesoscale combustion experiments under controlled conditions. And we realized that in rebuilding sort of what we would see as the reincarnation of the Southern Fire Lab, will never be the giant facility that was constructed in Macon in 1959. We have to be tactical and nimble, and also we're we're relatively few and we need help. And that's why we decided to reach outwards. And though we're not truly virtual because we do have a brick and mortar facility, we feel like we're trying to act as a hub for a network of people to get together and work on prescribed fire science and modeling. So sort of our catchphrase, I don't know if it's a catchphrase, our motto is a commitment to empowering prescribed fire users with the best science and technology. And this comes from the recognition that a burn boss, when he decides to ignite a fire, is making a very profound decision. He's applying fire to a landscape that is not on fire, and he's responsible for the consequences of that fire, or she is responsible for the consequences of that fire. And there's really not a lot of support, scientific support or modeling support for that decision making. And we felt like it's time to try and, rectify that situation. So right now, our focus is to use some computationally efficient coupled fire atmosphere models, mostly relying on Quickfire because it is computationally efficient. We're going to have to revolutionize the way we collect fuels in space and time and forest monitoring, because the requirements of these CFA models, and specifically Quickfire, require three-dimensional fuel inputs and three-dimensional forest structure to help build the wind flow and understand the wind fields. And our ultimate goal is to be able to create a solution to scenario testing that is fast, accurate, will allow managers to explore changes in ignition techniques, how to integrate silviculture into predicting what the impacts of the fire behavior and fire effects will be. And when you sit in to a briefing on any prescribed fire, the objectives are always ecological, and hazardous fuels reduction is always in there as well. But we need to be able to start answering some of these questions. What's the best way to ignite this burn block so that we minimize scorch and maximize hardwood top kill? Those kinds of questions need answering. So our strategy is to build this network. Our modeling approach is modular. We're focusing on kind of a cellular automata approach, hybrid sometimes, but we want the framework to be modular so we can add components like fire effects, smoke, anything you can think of. And we all recognize that we needed to work in 3 dimensions. So the core network that we've developed right now, including several folks in the Missoula Fire Lab, is centered around Athens as the hub, but equal players all over the country. We have critical partnerships with all kinds of different researchers, and Northern Research Station, Nick Skowronski is central to the 3-dimensional fuels inventory and modeling. Gallagher, we've got Matt Jolly, Russ Parsons, Dan Jimenez, Sharon Hood, and Rocky Mountain that are critical to our work on fuel moisture, fast fuels, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through the name, but this is how we see ourselves functioning, as this pretty tightly defined group of people with a singular focus on improving prescribed fire application and science. So I'm going to switch gears and tell you about our demonstration project. So we've put together the hub. This is only 6 or 8 months old. The idea began about a year ago with conversations mainly led by Kevin Hires, just on the idea of like, the time's right, let's do it. We've got maturing technology. We've got a pretty good CFA model that we can lean on. Let's try this. And so part of our approach is to do these demonstration landscapes where we start from scratch, cooking from scratch. We take a landscape and we develop both the 3-dimensional fuelscape. We run Quickfire simulations, and we also collect evaluation data on actual prescribed fires. So the first demo landscape that I'm going to talk about that we just finished this spring was Piedmont National Wildlife Refuge and Hitchity Experimental Forest. And we're going to use these demonstration landscapes to refine our techniques and start uncovering new questions and new avenues of research and model development. I'm not a very good manager, I'll admit it. So we also need to develop a operating plan, an efficient operating plan, so that we can accomplish our goals effectively in a timely manner. So the modeling framework that we're implementing on our demo landscapes is conceptualized here with, we have two sort of hubs or wheels that with Quickfire's one axle and 3D scanning of forest structure and fuels as the other. And these modules represent the kind of inferences and information you can get from both of these, both Quickfire and the 3D forest structure and fuels information, and they connect. So obviously forest structure influences drag and wind flow through a stand during a fire. So the atmospheric dynamics that is involved in Quickfire is structured by the LiDAR data that gives us the forest structure. And obviously fuels is vegetation, and there's these connections, but they do represent two independent entities, and there's applications that apply to both independently as well as them being connected. So Quickfire is a coupled fire atmosphere model. It's a combination of combustion cellular automata model called FireCA and a wind field solver called QuickHerb, developed by Los Alamos National Labs. And it's a coupled fire atmosphere model because the combustion properties and the buoyancy induced by the heat generation feed into the wind field. The wind field feeds back into the fire behavior portion, and they interact with each other to produce relatively, and from my perspective, realistic fire behavior and capture realistic fire phenomena. So a CA model, just quick background, is a modeling approach. It's a spatially explicit modeling approach where autonomous agents, an entity that you're attempting to model the behavior of, its behavior is governed by rules, and these rules are influenced by the domain as well. So that however you construct your domain, so if in the example of FireCA, the autonomous agents are discretized heat energy packets. And so the behavior of those heat energy packets is governed by some physics-based rules that are fundamentally based on conservation of mass momentum and heat energy. And what happens to them and how they subsequently behave is influenced not only by those governing equations, but by what's in the cell adjacent to them and where they land when they move around. I can get into this more in the question and answer if you want, and there's a paper on it too. The approach is effective because it's computationally efficient. So instead of trying to solve partial differential equations, you can run the rules instead and capture the phenomena. One of the sticking points for a long time was, well, how do you build the domain? When you think about trying to create a large landscape that has the three-dimensional characteristics of every tree on the landscape, 25, 30 years ago, people would have thought that that'll never happen. But with the maturation of LiDAR technology, we can actually do this relatively easy. This is LiDAR, this is some tree mapping and tree identification work that was done on the LiDAR flights that we flew last winter at the Hitchity demo that I'm now going to really dig into. The other thing that we've been lucky, and this is why the partnership with Missoula is so important, is fast fuels is really going to be, we're going to lean on fast fuels heavily. It's a really effective and amazing approach to capturing forest structure in a way that will be seamlessly integrated into how Quickfire and a lot of other models behave, including some fire effects models that we're working on. So we're real happy to have Russ as a partner in this endeavor. So these are a smattering of some of the planned demo sites, and the big red star in the middle is the Piedmont National Wildlife Refuge and Hitchity Experimental Forest location. It's in the Piedmont of Georgia. We hope to start knocking off these other demo sites after we finish the Piedmont over the next couple of years. We're getting more efficient, and the Piedmont National Wildlife Refuge is also the home of the Hitchity Experimental Forest. And so today I'm going to focus on, we had 3 experimental prescribed fires, each around 700 acres, that we wanted to use as test beds for our approach. And I'm going to focus on this western burn block. It was about 550 acres for the rest of the demo discussion that I'm going to have today. Prior to the fire, we scanned, we had an airborne LiDAR scan. We also installed a bunch of plots on the ground to do fuel sampling, physical fuel sampling, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the more LiDAR work that we did. So the airborne 3D was acquired in January, about 2 months before the planned burn, generously supported by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We ended up scanning the entire Piedmont and all 5,000 acres of the Hitchity. And we went out and across the landscape supplemented those airborne scans with terrestrial scans to really try and drill in on some of the forest and fuel characteristics at scales much finer than would be achievable with the airborne LiDAR. Prior to the fire, we put out some instrumentation to collect fire radiant energy release and track some allied experiments on fire effects. And then we worked cooperatively with Region 8 with several great colleagues in Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest and Region 8 Fire and Aviation, Mike Ward, Mike Davis, Mike Broad, the local burn bosses, Tim Kolnick, Charlie Gray, and also Ben Hornsby, who was our in-house burn boss, but who is now taking a job as a regional fuels coordinator for the Fish and Wildlife. So this is Ben's leaving us next week. So a little tear, if you can see a little tear coming to my eye, that's because Ben is moving on to greener pastures. But we organized a prescribed fire, and this was exceptional in one main way, in that we were able to secure a UAS module to do the ignition. And this allowed us to track literally the location of every ping pong ball that was dropped. We were able to log the GPS position and the rate of ball deployment. And that allowed us to map the ignition pattern with a precision that we never would have been able to do. And we're real thankful for that opportunity. So we have the fire being ignited. Oops. And it was a typical prescribed fire, operational prescribed fire in the Piedmont, where you have all different kinds of fire behavior occurring across a very complex landscape, probably 3 or 4 different vegetation types, some decent terrain, a bunch of different fuels. So as a demo, it was a perfect opportunity. So for the Quickfire run, we were able to use the ALS to create digital elevation models at the level of resolution that we needed. We were able to construct tree maps and capture forest structure. We're still working on surface fuels, but we're using several sort of new techniques to build surface fuels that capture the heterogeneity at the relevant scale. And we need to work on fuel moisture, but we collected fuel moisture during the burn and informed the model with met data from local raws. And we were also fortunate to be able to get really good ignition location data. It was all timed and mapped. So here's a Quickfire simulation of the burn. Topography on the left, fuels map on the right. This is only the surface fuels. Only the surface fuels were involved in this fire. And you can see the kind of resolution you can get from Quickfire. The domain is comprised of 2 meter voxels, 2 by 2 by 2 meter voxels. And so all the fire CA operations and quick herb operations are occurring at that scale. And so, yeah, that looks great. It's a good animation and it looked realistic. But we noticed a few interesting things from the simulation. The first is that we did not have any escapes on this burn, but you can see that in this initial run of Quickfire, we had a bunch of escapes. And they're interesting because the escapes occurred in places where you would expect them to occur. So for instance, this kind of crook in the road here would be a watch out spot if you're on a prescribed fire. It's likely that this little crook in the road is at the top of a slope. So the fire would be running up the slope Sorry about that. And that's a good spot where you would likely see a slop over. But none occurred. So we were thinking, what's going on? Well, one, the model was a success and it identified potential trouble spots on this particular burn unit. But two, we're like, well, we can do, like, what do you think happened? So one of the things we realized that our surface fuel moisture estimates were very kind of coarse, based off of just a few samples taken hourly during the fire. But we realized that we could make some inferences about fuel moisture just based on the relationship between vegetation and topography. So we just did this is something that happened yesterday. So this is really hot off the press. We just used an elevation contour and doubled the fuel moisture below 120 feet elevation where the bottomlands and the landscape are. And then we ran it again. And we see that the difference is subtle. The fire behavior did not change tremendously, but subsequently to that minor little tweak in fuel moisture, we had no escapes. And it's interesting because the escapes occurred in areas that were well above the elevation contour that we changed the fuel moisture. So the dynamics of the fire atmosphere interactions changed just with that little tweak enough so that the fire stayed in bounds. And so you can see the final burned area over here is an escape, over here is an escape. These little crooks in either the roads or the creeks were areas that you'd watch out. Not a huge difference in total area burned, but like I said, it stayed in bounds. Very interesting. Still thinking about that. So the other thing that as an ecologist I was really interested in is we get a spatially explicit accounting of fire energy released during the fire from Quickfire. And so our fuel domain is still under development, as I said, but we had fuels concentrated under tree crowns where you'd expect them to be. And it's probably a little bit more evenly distributed than we have here. But when you zoom into an area and look at fire heat flux, you start to see how realistic the fire behavior as captured by Quickfire is. The fire line interactions show up, the backing fires, the flanking fires interacting and meeting. And when I saw, like I said, this is something I've just seen a couple of days ago. So, I'm giving you hot off the press kind of model runs here. I had this huge sort of contentment that we were on the right track. And the numbers matched with some of our heat flux measurements in the field. So we're still working on how to evaluate some of the heat flux numbers in a more quantitative way, but ballpark estimates looked pretty good. So if we look at the maximum heat flux in that same area, the topography on the right showed that there was a rise on the lower left-hand corner of the graph, and you got and that's where you got your highest maximum intensity. So as the fires were running upslope and into piney fuels from bottomland fuels, you did see an increase in fire intensity. And then being able to map the total heat flux is going to directly tie to our predictions of fire effects, for instance, on top kill. So we'll be able to come up with the threshold dose of energy that would be required to kill different size stems of undesirable species, for example, and be able to make predictions on how different ignition patterns might influence the outcome from that perspective. So that's the framework. That's some of the first trials of our framework. And we have a lot of ongoing work that we obviously are going to need help with and new collaborators. So obviously continue evaluating the model, especially focusing in on heat flux and some of the phenomenology that occurs at a subgrid level, some assumptions that need to be tested. We need to do a better job both characterizing surface fuels and understanding what we need to characterize in the surface fuels. How much heterogeneity do we actually need to capture? We're looking forward to linking the model output to dose-dependent fire effects and handing off the heat energy to smoke tools and looking at ignition scenarios and how they influence smoke dynamics. And then I'll talk just 2 seconds about some spin-offs that have already emerged from the work. So our surface fuel R&D, this is being done by at least 5 or 6 different teams across the country. Some of them are working independently, but we'll take whatever we can get. But we really need to get a grip on what we need to capture and at what level, sort of, thinking about scale, complexity, what the model sees, what it doesn't see. And we also need to make sure, however we decide to construct our fuel beds, is something that we can easily expand to a landscape level. The mechanistic fire effect stuff is ongoing. This is work that was funded by CERTUP, and we're making great headway there in developing sort of dose metrics so that we will be able to then make these predictions based on the Quickfire output. And the handoff to the smoke emissions, there's actually a lot of work going on there. I'm not a smoke person, so I can't tell you too many details about that, but I've heard from the experts that it's going to be an efficient and effective way to hand off the heat information to the smoke models and the consumption information. So the spinoff, one of the really interesting spinoffs that has emerged, is the sort of remote sensing archaeology. So when we started doing some of these landscape scale LiDAR surveys, some cultural artifacts started emerging. And we have a postdoc who's an archaeologist who's actually looking at using Quickfire to make sort of investigations in how prescribed fire activities could be tuned to mitigate damage to cultural resources. But just discovering the presence of these thousands and thousands of former tar kilns that were used to harvest naval stores back in the 1700s, and what that influence had on the landscape, was pretty fascinating. So what I'm going to end with here is way back in the early 2000s, we had dreamed of constructing a unified prescribed fire model, one that would be spatially explicit, that would be cross scale, and that would be sort of cross processes. It would have ecological, community ecology, ecosystem dynamics, fire behavior. It would feed smoke models. And one of the reasons why we're pushing the hub now is we feel like that's attainable. Obviously, we need more work, but the idea that we have this framework, we have the engines that can drive this framework, is really exciting to me, and I hope you're excited too. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is 3D is better. I've learned that the work being done to inform Quickfire has standalone applications, and that it allows you to collect rapid three-dimensional inventories of forest structure in ways that are unprecedented. And not only is it better for building CFA appropriate landscapes in terms of fuels and forest structure, it's got all kinds of potential for better fuels and ecological monitoring and evaluation of management. And so where are we going? We're gonna keep refining our approach. We're gonna add modules through our definitions. We're looking to try and increase our work capacity. We are few in number. We need more help. We need to improve some of our data processing methodologies, and we would like to hand off the approach to people working in other systems, for instance, Western systems. See if our approach is relevant and will work in completely different ecosystems and different fire regimes. And so that's where I'm going to stop sharing, and I would love to chat. Let me get back to, all right. Am I there? Everything okay?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joe. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so we're just going to go ahead and open it up for questions. If you have a question, you can just unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand if you prefer to do it that way. You can also type a question to the chat box, and we can read it from there.
You know what? One last thing. Just let me share my last slide. I forgot my acknowledgement slide. Can everybody see that?
I don't see your slides right now.
Oh, okay, hold on. How about now?
Not yet.
Oh man. All right. Well, I wanted to, yeah. Okay. Hold on. I just, I'm failing to acknowledge the extensive collaborations and support that, I'm speaking as the royal we here. There's a list of about 20 people, 30 people, 40 people that I should have mentioned, but I want to thank everybody who's participated, and hopefully they know who they are. But my whole team, obviously in Athens, and all of my collaborators, Rocky Mountain, Northern, PNW, Andy Hudak, et cetera, et cetera. So, and obviously my funders, the Region 8 and Fish and Wildlife Service and USGS have been pretty instrumental in supporting us. So, sorry for that poor segue there. Let me turn on my cameras back on there. Okay.
Looks like we've got a comment here from Greg Dillon in the chat. Let's see. He says it's really exciting work. Thanks for the presentation. Yes, what do you see as a potential for scaling up this level of detail and fuels mapping to the National Land Fire Program? Do you see the possibility of being able to do this kind of modeling for any landscape in the US?
Yeah, I do. I do. Especially once yes, absolutely. I think the LiDAR kind of data that feeds the downscaling of the surface fuels is widely available and is getting more and more widely available. And the techniques are going to get better and better. So yes, I do. I think this is the future, honestly. And yes, so I'm going to give a strong yes to that statement.
Still have some time for questions if people want to either type in the chat or just unmute yourself if that's easier. Just jump in here and ask a question. Maybe we'll give it just a few minutes here. Joe, maybe while we're waiting, we worked on a project together over the summer, part of a
Yeah.
project that was funded by CERTUP, looking at how fire spreads through different kinds of discontinuities in the fuels. And we've completed some lab experiments now for that project. Does that fit into this work at all? Or do you
Yes.
plan to do any like quick fire comparisons or anything with those
Yep.
experiments?
Absolutely. Yes, that is, as a matter of fact, I've been talking with Dan about that. Yes, we're going to do that. And that work might actually be starting real soon, just trying to come up with, and we'll be in contact with you, obviously, in designing sort of different approaches. One of the things we were interested in is how does like a curving fire break, like looking at sort of more complex geometry to the gap affect sort of how fire crosses the gap and those kinds of interactions. I think quickfire, it'd be really interesting to test it with those kinds of scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I look forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Oh, one just popped into the chat. Yep, there's a question. Having worked in both places, do you think it's fair to compare prescribed burning complexity in the South and the West as has been done in the press recently?
No, I mean, that's boy, thanks for that loaded question. This is being recorded too, right? And Kara's one of these collaborators that I failed to mention, but I think there are some really fundamental differences in landscapes and fuels that, while I think there's a lot to be learned from how prescribed fire is conducted in the South, that certainly can inform the West, and also there's some issues with just comfort with ignition and comfort with actually lighting prescribed fires that can be built through training exchanges or just working in the South and getting comfortable with exposure to prescribed fire that could really help improve the situation out West. But yeah, there's fundamental differences in terms of landscape dissection. The Southeast, we have roads everywhere, and the fuels are often not quite as volatile as some of the fuels out West, like chaparral, although we do have them in Florida. And where you see big, crazy wildfires in the East are places like Florida, where you do have those kinds of fuels. So there's a tremendous amount of overlap, but there are fundamental differences that are important. But I think there's a lot to be learned from prescribed fire activities in the South.
Great. I see Kara has her hand up. Kara, go ahead.
Hey, Joe, thanks so much. Great presentation.
Thanks.
Hey, I really like the hot off the press data results with the topography taken into account, which immediately made me wonder just how sensitive everything is to small changes in moisture. So can you kind of give just a little more, if you're willing,
Sure.
on how much of a difference or a shift in moisture that was, and how sensitive the model is to it?
The shift in moisture was pretty dramatic. So we doubled the fuel moisture, which I believe, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think the field measurements were around like 8, 10, 12%. So we pushed it up to right at the threshold of moisture of extinction. But that sort of matched what we were seeing in the field, that, the fire was petering out in these bottomlands that are normally pretty moist. So yes, it was fairly sensitive to it. What was really interesting, and this, like I said, it's hot off the press, is while it didn't appear dramatic in the sort of summary slide of total area burn, something was fundamentally different in the whole dynamics of the fire, such that it didn't loft energy packets across the line to start spot fire. So there was some emergent properties from altering fuels in the bottoms that influenced fire behavior in other areas of the domain that weren't, so it seems sensitive is what I'm thinking. And, part of the energy in the model goes to drying up the fuel. So obviously it's a heat sink that could have a major influence, but, I'm the wrong person to talk to about sensitivity analysis of fire CA. There's people who could make much better answers than I can on that. But that's what sort of, in my brief studying of that exercise, it showed, yes, it really matters. And we know it matters on the ground in many ways, especially with other fuel types, not just the fine fuels, the coarser fuels. So there's a lot of work to be done with fuel moisture.
I love it. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we got another question in the chat here from Trevor Miller. The identification of probable areas of escape is super interesting. Was there a suppression effect during implementation as the easy go-to explain differences in model outputs and on-the-ground results?
Yeah. I mean, the operations folks know those spots, and they'll put holding resources in those areas as they ignite, and also they use their ignition skills to mitigate those kinds of spots, and they're well aware of them. So part of and this goes back to Kara's question, is like part of the escape, sort of the interesting patterns of escape in that fuel moisture question, where like when we, I was actually on the fire on that corner, and while it was the sportiest corner of the fire, there really never was any threat of an escape because of the skill of the igniters. But I think scenario testing from that perspective is something that a lot of the operations folks were really interested in. They were, it's funny, I had a conversation with Mike Ward, and he said, what happens inside the unit is not necessarily as interesting to me as what happens outside of the unit. So that's, that feeds into that. Okay, if it pops across the line here, what's going to happen? And by collecting landscape level information on fuels, we'll be able to potentially answer that question. But that's, that's one of the real scenario testing is one of our big goals.
All right. Let's see. Sarah Brown's asking, could the model be tested, verified by running it on some of the complex prescribed fires that have had to have fire reviews written after escapes?
Yeah, and yes, and Kevin Hires would be a good person to talk to about that, because I believe they have done some of those exact simulations with both wildfires and prescribed fires where there was some issues. I have not done it personally, but yes, there's nothing, inherently, there's no reason why you couldn't do that. And I think that's another application that we haven't really even scratched the surface of yet. That's a really good one.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Joe. I don't see any other questions coming in right now, so maybe we are going to start wrapping up. Thanks again for your time, Joe, and for telling us about all your work. This is pretty cool stuff.
And come on, and come when it's safe. Come on down south, and we'll light a fire together.
I just have a couple of comments here. Let me see if I can share my screen for a second. Yep. So for next week, October 21st, we have Faraz and Dan Gorham from the IBHS facility talking about from Wind to Fire, the IBHS test chamber. And so the connection link will be the same. It'll be the same time, 11 to 12 Mountain Time. And then, you know, as always, you can send us suggestions for speakers or topics. You can just email me here at this address if you have ideas. We're full for this seminar for this semester, but we are taking suggestions for the spring series. So thanks everyone. We'll see you back here next week.
All right, thanks.